In recent times, traditional Catholics have become famous for their insistence that the traditional Latin Mass is superior to the New Order Mass. And many different Catholics, even traditional Catholics, seem to have varying views on this. And there have been many arguments about whether the traditional Latin Mass is truly superior to the new Mass, whether the new Mass is really quite as evil as many people are making it out to be, whether a quote unquote reverent New Order Mass is better than the regular New Order Mass, or whether it's even perhaps a reverent New Order Mass is even equal to the traditional Latin Mass. But the common thread here is that the traditional Catholics, to varying degrees, always insist that the traditional Latin Mass is superior, and this has confused many people. So, after Vatican II was done and the New Order Mass was instituted, the Society of St. Pius X, founded by Archbishop Lefebvre, became very famous for their insistence that the traditional Latin Mass was better than the New Order Mass. And not only that, but the SSPX priests actually refused to say the New Order Mass. And as time went on, the SSPX actually made it the official stance of their society that if any Catholic had to face the choice between attending the traditional Latin Mass and attending the New Order Mass, he should always attend the traditional Latin Mass no matter what. And as that went on, the SSPX also made it clear that if a Catholic had the choice between either attending the New Order Mass or not being able to attend any Mass whatsoever, so let's say, for example, that a Catholic normally attended the traditional Latin Mass in their uh, home diocese at an SSPX church, but then they went on vacation to an island somewhere, and the island had a New Order church on it, but it didn't have any SSPX churches on it. Then the SSPX made it quite clear that their parishioners should not be attending, or at least the faithful who attended their chapels should not attend the New Order church on that island while they were on vacation, even if it was the only mass around. So it's either the traditional Latin Mass or pretty much nothing. The New Order Mass was completely off bounds, and many Catholics were absolutely horrified by that decision. Many other Catholics praised it as being heroic. And then we had the Fraternity of St. Peter come along, which claimed that the traditional Latin Mass was infinitely superior to the New Order Mass. But generally speaking, if Catholics didn't have a traditional Latin Mass available, then they should opt for the quote unquote most reverent New Order Mass that they could find. And that was pretty much the stance that most of the Ecclesia Dei communities took after the Fraternity of St. Peter broke away from the SSPX. And this has confused many people, especially leading into the 21st century as the quote unquote traditional Catholic movement has grown, because there are many, many people who call themselves traditional Catholics, and they all seem to have varying beliefs. So, for opinions on there, some traditional Catholics love the Divine Mercy devotion, while other traditional Catholics claim that it's a complete hoax and that it's false. It's a trick of the devil, and that Saint Faustina is, in fact, not a saint. Some traditional Catholics claim that Pope John Paul II, was a great man who made a few mistakes here and there, but overall he did try to do the right thing, while other traditional Catholics claim that Pope John Paul II was in fact a absolutely horrible man, and he absolutely, certainly, without a doubt, was not a saint. There's absolutely no way that he's a saint. And I think this is kind of important to point out because many people often talk about the quote unquote traditional Catholics as if they're one united solid block of people who all think in unison, and they're not. They're really a mishmash of jumbled people with many different beliefs. They agree on all that much. They get into fights often. And it's kind of important to keep that in mind, that just because somebody calls himself a quote unquote traditional Catholic does not mean at all that they are going to agree with even other traditional Catholics on many things. Sometimes they will, but not always. And so today we're going to talk about whether or not the traditional Latin Mass can compare to a reverent New Order Mass, or how I should say the reverent New Order Mass compares to the traditional Latin Mass. Because what many people will say is that following Vatican II, the New Order Mass was introduced into the world, and there were many liturgical abuses. There were the clown masses where all the priests dressed up as clowns. There were the basketball masses where they all dressed up as basketball players. There were weird dancing masses where people just break out dancing on the middle of the altar. The communion hosts were getting dropped and, chucked into cardboard boxes and whatnot, left and right. There were just all these horrible problems. And many people say, well, yeah, sure, that was definitely a problem, and we're not going to pretend that it didn't happen. But here's the thing: there is nothing in the rule book that says that the New Order Mass has to be celebrated that way. And one of the big quote unquote complaints that I think many traditional Catholics have with the New Order Mass is how irreverent it is. So, people say, oh, well, the traditional Latin Mass is superior to the New Order Mass because it's said in Latin, the priest faces ad orientem, the singing is usually Gregorian chant or something similar. They don't have banjos strumming campfire type songs, and everybody receives kneeling and on the tongue. And that is why the traditional Latin Mass is superior. And many of the New Order Catholics will respond to that by saying, oh, well, here's the thing. You can incorporate all of those practices into the New Order Mass as well. You can say the New Order Mass in Latin. You can have the priest at the New Order Mass facing toward the altar. You can have incense at the New Order Mass. You can have people in the New Order Mass receive kneeling on the tongue. So why are the traditional Latin Mass Catholics so insistent that the traditional Latin Mass is better? Why don't, instead of fighting over the traditional Latin Mass versus the New Order Masses, why don't we just have everybody come over to the New Order Mass so that we can all be, unified? Because New Order Catholics love the word unity, and they love talking about unity and how everyone needs to be united. Why don't we gather everyone together in the New Order Mass? However, the traditional Latin Mass Catholics can attend Masses that are said in Latin, facing towards the altar, etc. That won't be a problem. That will fix everything. And while this comes from a good place, it's not really addressing many of the original concerns that the traditional Latin Mass Catholics had. So I'm going to actually end up reading some brief documentation here explaining the difference between the traditional Latin Mass and the New Order Mass. First, I think I'm going to go over and show some of the differences in the rubrics and the prayers. Then I'm going to read a little bit from an SSPX website about their official, quote unquote, official stance towards the New Order Mass. And then I'm going to read a small overview, kind of a Cliff's Notes version of the Ottaviani intervention, and explain what that was about and why Cardinal Ottaviani and Cardinal Bacci objected to the New Order Mass. But first, I'm going to explain where all of this confusion surrounding the quote-unquote reverent New Order Mass came from, why everybody's seems to be on different pages about it, what's all the confusion, what's all the division. So when the New Order Mass was first introduced, not many people liked it. Or I should say, there were many people who did not like it. Let's put it that way. But nobody was really quite sure how to respond to it, because on one hand, if you go strictly to the New Order Mass and you don't attend the traditional Latin Mass anymore, then you're breaking with the Mass that all the saints for thousands of years have attended. On the other hand, if you choose to attend the traditional Latin Mass, well, then you're more or less, in a certain sense, going against the express wishes of the Pope and the Vatican, who have declared that they want the New Order Mass to replace everything. And this is kind of placed Catholics in a bind. And as a traditional Catholic myself, I often tend to more or less subtly make fun of the Catholics who cry about obedience and nothing else. They just say, oh, you need to be obedient, you need to be humble, you need to be obedient, you must give in to whatever the Pope wants, you have to be obedient. But at the same time, it is kind of understandable why they think that way. Every single Catholic has the principle of obedience pounded into them from a young age. So when you kind of get to this weird breaking point where it seems either you have to pick between tradition, which the Catholic Church has held onto for hundreds of years, versus obedience, then you're kind of placed in a bit of a bind. And most Catholics, after the New Order Mass was introduced, were kind of confused. So the SSPX, as has already been discussed, made it their official stance that traditional, or Catholics in general, just should not attend the New Order Mass whatsoever. And I'm going to explain why here pretty shortly. Then the Ecclesia Dei communities came out and broke away after the 1988 consecrations of the bishops that Archbishop Lefebvre performed. And the Ecclesia Dei communities claimed that the traditional Mass was probably superior, but the New Order Masses were kind of just as good. And they were kind of placed in a weird little area, because they had to sign documents claiming complete obedience to the Pope and to the Vatican. So they had to kind of tiptoe along this fine line where on one hand, They really didn't like anything to do with the New Order Mass or anything to do with the quote unquote conciliar church, but they still had to kind of play the Pope's game and play the Vatican's game. So they were really placed in a kind of untenable position where they had to jump between being firmly traditional, but also had to kind of leave the New Order Mass alone and not really, they weren't really allowed to say anything bad about it. So that was kind of a weird position for them. Then you had the diocesan masses pop up, and this is really where this is really getting to the heart of the confusion about the quote unquote reverent New Order masses. Because what would happen here is that many priests, we can call them conservative Catholic priests, who grew up attending the New Order Mass, and then they started saying the New Order Mass. That's what they were trained to do in the seminary. Many of them would start reading and trying to figure out how to become more orthodox and become holier. And through one way or another, they would often stumble into the traditional Latin Mass and to the traditional movement. And generally, by this point, the priests were thoroughly steeped in what you could call the conciliar church. They were not really traditionalists. They liked saying the New Order Mass. They were fine with saying the New Order Mass, and they were fine with the New Order way of doing things. But they also kind of liked the traditional Latin Mass because it was beautiful, it was very reverent, and the prayers were great. And so what they would start doing is maybe they'd offer, say, a traditional Latin Mass at 12 o'clock in their churches on Sunday. Throughout the rest of the week and throughout all the other Masses on Sunday, they'd keep the New Order Masses in, but they'd start offering that option. And what would happen is their parishioners would stumble into the traditional Latin Mass of that church one day and think, oh, this is great, I'm going to keep coming back. This is where the confusion comes in, because while these priests were definitely saying the traditional Latin Mass, and while the lay people at their churches were attending the traditional Latin Mass, a good chunk of the time, the lay people who were attending the New Order Masses didn't know anything about the SSPX. They'd never heard about Archbishop Lefebvre. They'd never heard about the 1988 consecrations. If you asked them what the term Ecclesia Dei communities meant, they'd have absolutely no clue what you were talking about. They didn't really know that much. They just knew that they attended the traditional Latin Mass one day. It looked beautiful. It looked reverent. It sounded great. It looked great. The prayers were very reverent, so they kept coming back to it. And what would happen is their friends and family members would notice them missing at the New Order Mass. Because remember, most traditional Catholics, or I should say most New Order Catholics, usually tend to attend the same Mass every day on Sundays, and they see their friends after Mass or their family members after Mass, and they'll talk to them. Their kids will run outside and play. And so when these people inevitably stop showing up to the New Order Masses, because now they're attending the traditional Latin Masses, a lot of their friends and family members would get curious as to why they were missing. And they would contact these Catholics that switched over to attending the traditional Latin Mass, and they'd say, hey, I haven't been seeing you at church on Sunday. Where have you been? And the Catholics would reply, oh, well, we have started going to the traditional Latin Mass instead. And this is where things start to get a little dicey, because then their friends and their family members would ask them, why are you attending the traditional Latin Mass where you don't know anybody? At the New Order Mass, you know us, your friends and your family members, so why aren't you attending the New Order Mass so that you can hang out with us? And that's where things really start to get dicey, because the true answer, the honest answer, is the Catholics would have to say, quite frankly, the traditional Latin Mass is far superior to the New Order Mass in practically every single way possible. And there's no way I'm ever going back to the New Order Mass. Absolutely not. But they can't say that, because if they do say that, then their friends and family members who still attend the New Order Mass are going to get really, really offended. And this is something that practically every single Catholic who switched over to the traditional Latin Mass from the New Order Mass has had to deal with. There have been many, many, many traditional Catholics who have switched over. They don't know anything about the SSPX or Archbishop Lefebvre. They're just trying to attend a new traditional reverent version of the Mass. And then their friends and their family members will start accusing them. Something that many traditional Catholics have been told is, oh, well, if you're attending the traditional Latin Mass, do you think that you're better than us or something like that? Because what will happen is the Catholics will say, I think that the traditional Latin Mass is very reverent, it's very beautiful, it's very good, the prayers are good, but what inevitably starts to leak through is the fact that they just don't think that the New Order Mass is good. So what a lot of the people attending the New Order Mass start to think in their heads is, oh, if they think that the traditional Latin Mass is so much better than the New Order Mass, then they must think that they're better than me. They must think that they're a holier Catholic than me. Now, the traditional Latin Mass Catholics, once they switch over to the traditional Latin Mass, truth be told, most of them tend to forget the New Order Mass relatively quickly until their friends and their family members start giving them a hard time and start badgering them about it. And at that point, you end up in a kind of a weird situation. They can't bash the New Order Mass, so what they instead say is, I don't necessarily dislike the New Order Mass. I just think that the traditional Latin Mass is very beautiful. It's very reverent. And so that's where the confusion comes in. Because what the SSPX originally said when they first declared that Catholics should not attend the New Order Mass was that the rubrics of the New Order Mass were horrible and that the Mass was displeasing to God, which I'm going to go into deeper detail in here shortly. Now, what most new traditional Latin Mass Catholics say when they're asked why they prefer the traditional Latin Mass is they'll just say that it's very beautiful, it's very reverent. So this is quite a clear, striking departure. The SSPX made it quite clear that the New Order Mass was inferior due to its rubrics, per se. And so now I'm going to go ahead and read part of an article. First, I'm going to read kind of the Cliff Notes version of the Ottaviani intervention, which was written by Cardinal Ottaviani to Pope Paul VI, explaining why he thought that the New Order Mass was inferior. And this is the brief summary that he wrote ahead of time. Part 1, History of the Change. The new form of the Mass was substantially rejected by the Episcopal Synod, was never submitted to the collegial judgment of the Episcopal conferences, and was never asked for by the people. It has every possibility of satisfying the most modernist of Protestants. Section 2, Definition of the Mass. By a series of equivocations, the emphasis is obsessively placed upon the quote-unquote supper and the quote-unquote memorial, instead of on the unbloody renewal of the sacrifice of Calvary. Section 3, Presentation of the Ends. The three ends of the Mass are altered. No distinction is allowed to remain between divine and human sacrifice. Bread and wine are only quote-unquote spiritually, not substantially, changed. Section 4, The Essence. The real presence of Christ is never alluded to, and belief in it is implicitly repudiated. Section 5, The Elements of the Sacrifice. The position of both priests and people is falsified, and the celebrant appears as nothing more than a Protestant minister, while the true nature of the Church is intolerably misrepresented. Section 6, The Destruction of Unity. The abandonment of Latin sweeps away for good and all unity of worship. This may have its effect on unity of belief, and the new order has no intention of standing for the faith as taught by the Council of Trent, to which the Catholic conscience is bound. Section 7, The Alienation of the Orthodox. While pleasing various dissenting groups, the new order will alienate the East. Section 8, The Abandonment of Defenses. The new order teems with insinuations or manifest errors against the purity of the Catholic religion and dismantles all defenses of the deposit of faith. And now I'm going to go ahead and read part of the SSPX website. The purpose of attending Mass is to give glory to God and to sanctify one's soul, but we hold that the new Mass is not pleasing to God and so dishonors him. As such, to attend the Novus Ordo Mass is to go against the very purpose for going to Mass. Instead of honoring God by attending Mass, one is dishonoring God by doing so. If the SSPX is correct about this, then it is right for its priest to dissuade the faithful from attending the Novus Ordo Mass when the occasion is right for providing this advice. The reasons for the SSPX holding the new Mass fails to honor God are many, but I will just summarize the primary reason here. Religious worship is the homage that we pay to God, as creatures who are submitted to him and owe him everything. The only act adequate for this is sacrifice. St. Thomas provides the essential characteristics of sacrifice. It includes 1. The offering of some sensible material thing to God. 2. With some change being accomplished in that thing by a priest. 3. With the purpose being to acknowledge God's supreme dominion and our subjection to him. This act of sacrifice is a symbolic representation of the fact that humans are creatures and God is God. Something dear to humans is taken and given completely to God to indicate that God is more important than the most precious of the things here on earth. It is material things that give humans power and enable them to exercise a certain lordship over others. In the act of sacrifice, humans surrender to God what gives them power, to indicate that he has ultimate power, that his power is greater than any power that can come from the things of this earth, and that we submit ourselves to his power. Sacrifice has always been the way in which humans have sought to show their subjection to higher powers. This is true of all the ancient pagan nations sacrificing to their gods, and of the chosen people before the coming of Moses, sacrificing to the one true God. But those sacrifices were designed by humans. It remained for God to provide explicit instructions on how to worship him. He did this with the institution of the Aaronic priesthood and the Levitical rites, through Moses, providing the Israelites the most perfect way to worship him before the coming of our Lord. When God teaches a people the way in which he is to be worshipped, they have a duty to fulfill what he has ordained. In the Old Testament, severe penalties fell upon the Israelites when they did not perform the prescribed worship, or they did not fulfill it in the correct way. This happened because humans have a duty to obey God. It is a contradiction if humans dishonor God in the very act that they are supposed to be honoring him. But it dishonors God when a people takes the worship that he has carefully instructed them to perform, and then they willfully modify that worship as they see fit. Consider how strange it would be for a king to arrive for his coronation ceremony, and instead of him being presented with a crown for his head, instead he is given a top hat. There is a similar but greater unfittingness when we take a worship that God has prescribed and modify it. Now, the traditional Mass honors God's prescriptions for his own worship because it is completely attentive to the purpose of performing a sacrifice. At the offertory, the prayers clearly indicate that the bread and wine that are to be offered are to become a victim for sacrifice. At the consecration, the form, the way that the form is pronounced, and the bodily posture of the priest all indicate that a change takes place in the sacramental matter, a change that is equivalent to an immolation, because it represents the separation of our Lord's body and blood. Finally, at the communion, it is clear that a sacred victim is consumed to complete the sacrifice. These three elements of sacrifice, offering, immolation, and consummation, do not have to be accomplished in exactly the way they are in the traditional Mass for the purpose of offering a sacrifice to be served. The words and gestures can be different. However, they must clearly indicate that we are dealing with an offering, immolation, and consummation of a victim being presented to God by the priest. It is the glory of the traditional Mass that it does this so clearly, so profoundly, so majestically. If, however, a liturgy is constructed in such a way as to keep the sacrificial nature of the Mass, but make it secondary and hidden, if such a liturgy is constructed by Catholics for Catholic worship, when God himself has come on earth and shown us how to worship God properly, if, finally, this has been done in order to please those who have broken from the worship proper to God and who refuse to worship with priests, sacraments, and the Mass, then it should be very clear that the worship cannot be pleasing to God. But this is the case with the new Mass. It purposefully hides the fact that the Mass is a sacrifice. The new offertory does not prepare a victim, but merely represents some gifts of bread and wine being presented to God in exchange for spiritual blessings. The new consecration does not come across as a ritual formula for the purpose of immolating a victim, but rather as the reading of a gospel story. And the new communion does not present itself as the consummation of a victim, but rather as the communal sharing of a meal that helps us to remember the Last Supper. Moreover, this purposeful obfuscation of the Mass's very essence, and of what adequate worship of God is supposed to be, was done by Catholics who have a clear mandate from God to worship him in a certain way. And it was done to make the Mass more acceptable to Protestants, who disobeyed God in breaking with the Church and her God-given worship. This is the primary reason why SSPX priests encourage souls to stay away from the new Mass, even when they have no other Mass to go to for the fulfillment of their Sunday obligation. The new Mass purposefully takes away from the proper honor due to God, and so dishonors God. These are the objective facts about the new Mass. I do not make any statement here about the subjective dispositions of those attending it. It is clear that most of those who attend are not aware of the grave problems in the new liturgy, and so are not gravely culpable. But this does not take away from the objective fact that the new Mass is bad, and so it is good for SSPX priests to inform others why the new Mass is not worship pleasing to God, when they anticipate that the information will be well received." End quote. Okay, and something else that I'm going to go ahead and bring up, which I don't have any writings here to go off of. One of the most common arguments that people will hear when people claim that the traditional Latin Mass is superior is, oh, well, Jesus is still present at both Masses. And the New Order Mass is valid, because when many traditional Catholics will say the traditional Latin Mass is objectively superior, many New Order Catholics will immediately raise their fingers up in the air and shake their finger and say, oh, no, remember, they're both valid Masses. Something that has to be made clear here. Just because a Mass is valid does not mean the Mass is good. Just because something is valid does not mean that it is good. End of discussion. I think Father David Nix made the best analogy here, and it's an example that has been repeated many times. And he said, if you asked a young couple recently married how their marriage was going, and they just kind of shrugged indifferently and said, well, it's valid, what would you think of that marriage? Would you sit there and think, it's good, that marriage is valid and pleasing to God? No, of course not. You would sit there and think, oh boy, the only thing that they've got to go off of, the only positive thing they have to say about their marriage is that it's valid. That's really bad. And because we all know, just because a Catholic marriage is valid does not mean that a Catholic marriage is good, okay? There are many married people in the church. There are many different married couples, and some of them have very good, strong, holy marriages. They have very good. They've raised their children. Should say they've brought up, not raised. They've brought up their children well. They've instructed them well. They've ensured that their children have a good Catholic upbringing. The husband and the wife are very strongly united together. And then there are other Catholic couples who maybe haven't done such a good job. They haven't really taught their children anything about Catholicism. They've just tossed their kids into the public school system and let the public school system teach them all their important life lessons. The husband and the wife bicker with each other, and they never get along. The whole family is headed for disaster. Now, if somebody was to compare a very strong, healthy Catholic marriage to a very weak Catholic marriage and say, this husband and wife that are firmly united, they're bringing up their children, they're doing a much better job at parenting and being married than this other couple that just fights all the time and doesn't really seem to care about bringing up their children. How ridiculous would it be if somebody came in waving their finger and said, you can't say that the one marriage is better than the other because both marriages are valid? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. The bar for something being valid is also incredibly low. I think it was the SSPX priest, Father McFarland, who said that, technically speaking, if he had, a communion wafer, unconsecrated, he could just plop it onto a desk somewhere, quickly put his hands over it, rattle out the words of consecration, and technically speaking, that would be valid. It would be a validly consecrated host. Now, of course, he'd immediately be kicked out of the SSPX for doing that, because that would be an incredibly irreverent way to treat the host, but it's valid, right? So just saying, but it's valid, doesn't mean that something is actually good.